Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. Godtear, SFG. Godtear? Play on words there, yes. Godtear is Godtear for the Skirmish level, but it comes with a few caveats. What do you need to know? 1 versus 1. Let's do this. So the difference between this game and a lot of the other Skirmish games is that you start out with not only your main character here, you have your main big bad, your champion, but you also have a bunch of little minions that are going to be scrolling around, tagging along, trying to help you along your way, but also, giving sort of a push and a pull and a yin and a yang and a boost and a here and a there back and forth. And that's where this game sort of sets itself a little bit apart, because when you think of 1 versus 1 skirmish games, you think of run up, slug them out, take them out better than the other team. This, with several others, I'll say on the market more recently, have taken a twist on that classic trope and said, instead, what we're going to do is we're going to give you what you expect, but we're also going to turn it on its head a little bit so that you get a little bit more of the overall strategic nature that is sometimes lost in this head-to-head D&D smash Hulk go sort of thing, right? And that's what this is trying to give you, a la what you see in front of me. Therein lies the biggest benefit of this game. Therein lies the biggest will you or won't you like it. When we talk about 1 versus 1 skirmish level games, the victory point conditions, the end game scoring conditions, as well as the nuance to them is sometimes a little bit varied. As you can see here, what I have next to me is a rather large plethora or collection of sets. And this is both the biggest boon and the biggest curse of this game. Godtear, the Eternal Glade starter set. The name in that alone implies that this is all that you need to play. And as you can see on the board in front of me here, I've got it set up so that you can see what it looks like from a top-down perspective. You have 1 team versus 1 team. You have your player cards going in front of you, and then you go back and forth activating through 2 different phases. The tricky point here is that the core starter set gives you only these 2 base teams, whereas the rules that you are provided with initially say that ideally you should have 3 of these teams on a side. Therein lies the problem, both the blessing and the curse, hence the other accoutrements underneath. Now, this is where it's both, again, a boon and a curse. If you want more strategic depth, if you want a larger battlefield, think of this like your 40K or your Warhammers in something like that, right? You pick your point value, you go with that, you add complexity, you add depth, you add length if you so choose. And so this gives you the option to go 1-1. Mano a mano, or 2-on-2 or 3-on-3, but it's going to require you to pick up some extra hardware in order to do so, and it's going to give you the asymmetry with the champions and the minions that's going to go along with that. Your bashers, your healers, your manipulators, your environment changers, whatever you prefer in a combination that suits you towards your own needs. And that is probably the biggest strength of this game, like I've already alluded to. The space on the board is used more so than a lot of these other games in a very strategic manner. What you can see here is I have the middle of a round, where I have Morrigan in the red, Nia in the green. Champion a champion going for the banners and the victory points in the middle of this round. So I've got a blown up view here in a couple different angles so you can get a better sense of how the spatial arrangement is going to work. Morrigan, for example, and Nia each have their minions that they're going to be interacting with, not only just spatially, but also in terms of the boons and the curses that they're going to be able to affect or inflict, depending on if it's a status condition that it just does as an action, or if it's an effect of, say, an attack. Morrigan, for example, has a range of 4. Any of her minions within the range of 4, she can just move them to different spaces, and you can start to see, okay, how is that going to work? How is that going to be affected there? How are you going to be able to manipulate on Morrigan's turn the minions' potential actions when you're activating them, depending on what phase it in? Now, Nia, on the other hand, if all 3 courtslings are on the battlefield, she just gets an extra activation during that activation phase. And if these guys, these little quartz guys, are next to an objective hex and they're just there, you get to replace them with a new objective text. So in that case, not really a big deal. But all of a sudden, now I'm a little bit further away over here, or I can start sectioning off or making it harder for someone to get to me, or making it harder for their minions to get within range, as you can see, kind of going back and forth. Or potentially harder to get to my banner from Morrigan's distance standpoint in terms of having to choose, are they going to attack? Are they going to go for my banner, which is now maybe here if I placed it there? That's the dynamic that these options offer you. Hit effects from the Courtlings as well can afflict a slow token. So now they're going to afflict slow on all of these guys if they hit them. Or Morrigan and the Cold Bones actually get +1 to accuracy. So the number of dice that you're going to be rolling, depending on how many are nearby. And so that's also going to be just a dynamic that you're going to have to influence. Which do you prefer? The status, the damage, the accuracy, the movement? How are you going to prioritize those in terms of what's going to actually get you points at the end of each round? What happens in this game is you have two separate phases. The first phase is represented by the lighter side of the cards, where you are activating all of your cards, all of your minions and champions, and then the other person manages and activates all of theirs. When you do so, you flip over the cards to their darker background side of things to indicate that. Now, you also have a special card here in the middle that is your ultimate ability. That still gets flipped over because it also has two different phases that it can be activated in as well. Now, the second phase, you are activating everybody again, but it's a back and forth so that you are activating one then the other. And this is where it gets tricky, is the claiming, the banners, the movement, the spatial arrangement that you can find yourself in. These are the objective hexes in which you can lay your banner, which gets you more victory points than, say, even knocking out a minion or a champion when you have it at the end of the round. And this is the other aspect of things that I really like in this game. This is a tiered system. Again, it's probably going to be a blessing curse because this game tends to run a little bit longer just with the one-on-one because of this system at the same time. When we zoom out here, you can see on the board there's a track that corresponds to where things are at in terms of the current round. And so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be manipulating your track one way or the other to get either the closer or to manipulate it to your side so that it's on your side at the end of the round. And each round also scores for different points on the backside. It's a tiered system like I mentioned. So round 3, you score 3 points. Round 1 is 1, 2 is 2, 3 is 3, 4 is 2, and 5 is 1. First one to 5 points wins. So it's a very balanced system there as well, allowing you to mitigate, to react, to plan differently depending on what your opponent has done in the previous rounds. And you're given the chance to do so each time. That's where I think the 1 versus 1 just doesn't really quite capture with what you need to have with some of the asymmetry and the full potential dynamics of this game. I mean, there are some crazy cool abilities on the bottoms of these cards. You each have 2 to 3 different effects that are going on with ranges, with how many occupants are in an area, determining how big the effect is or how strong the attack is. And they just have 2 phases on each side that are going to give you plethora of options. And the exploration, the combination, and the cohesiveness between not just one of these units, but potentially even 2 or 3 of these on the same side of your battlefield is really where the strength of this game lies. But again, that's where the steep learning curve also goes, because the steep learning curve is going to make it so that this game is going to go a lot longer, and you may not want a longer game that is playing in this ilk, because this isn't what I always think of when I think of, lengthier games. I think of, my dungeon crawls, my scenario-based situational games with open worlds. I think of my heavy, deep worker placement crunchy Euros. I don't think of my tactical skirmish game on a map. I think of those typically more as a little bit of a lighter affair overall. And so if you're looking for something heavier, this is top notch. The other thing I'll say is this rule book leaves somewhat to be desired in terms of how to play. SFG did an absolutely fantastic playthrough example of it, which is widely available, but the rule book just leaves some gaps in errata, in some of the FAQ, and some of the just obvious nature of how things are put together. Once you get past that, once you dive down with multiple teams on a battlefield, the strategy is like the layers of my kids' beds, right? There's too many covers to count. And that's what you end up having with the combinatorial system of these single soul expansions that you can mix and match depending on who you prefer, what play style you want to do, and how you find your tastes altering as you play and go along. Now, this is to say that you're still using a dice-based system where you're going to be rolling dice with blanks, 1s and 2s on them in order to see how well you hit and if you can overcome the protection and the defenses of your opponent, thus damaging them, causing health damage, and potentially knocking them out. You can also stomp out someone's banner and take it off the map if you so choose. The other incredibly nice tactical difference here is that these objective hexes can only be traversed by champions. So you have to be very aware of where your minions are, where your minions can be positioned, and how they're actually going to be able to affect you, because a lot of the cards that I mentioned here, there's a distance and an effect of the minions on the champions and the champions on the minions that you're going to need to have. And if you get a little bit too far out of range, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you dearly, and potentially the round and even the game. Apart from that even, you have about 4 basic status effects that are going to be affecting your basic statistics that you find on these cards, your protection, your health, your dodge, as well as your attacking. And so all of those are going to be available. And the interesting, both in a positive as well as a puzzling way, that they've chose to incorporate is that it affects all of a minion. So if my one little crystal rock guy here gets affected, all of my crystal rock guys, no matter where they are on said battlefield here, are also going to get affected. So it doesn't matter where said crystal rock guy is. If he's on this side, if these are on this side, it doesn't matter where they are, they're all subsequently affected. That's also, a different twist on things. The other thing that I'll say is I just have the basic setup here on the board. You have the objective hexes in the middle, sort of set up in the beginning opening scenario. But you open this rule book up, and they've got a handful of scenarios that give you different setups for the objective hexes, but also, more importantly, at the bottom of each of these pages, they tell you what happens at the end of each phase of each turn, at the end of each round, or potentially just what the objective hexes are going to do to adapt to the board. You get ones like Chaos here. At the end of each phase of each turn, if you lost the turn, you can place an objective hex anywhere on the map. Or, for example, Quest, you only get points for the banners who are on the opposing team's side of the field. It just changes the whole dynamic of the terrain. Change, death. At the end of turn, player who lost removes 2 objective hexes. If there are any models, when they're removed, they remain there. So you're slowly whittling things down. Life, you're adding things on a turn-by-turn basis, meaning you're having to maneuver this more and more around each time because this is expanding. And all of a sudden, you can't get to your champion who was formerly next to you, and now they're in the center, and now it's a lot harder to utilize those interactions that I just mentioned, right? How do you adapt? How do you survive? How do you utilize what's in front of you in terms of the teams? The sweet spot is probably 2 teams per side. Do you feel like you're knowledgeable enough and your interactions are strong enough that you could do all 3 teams? Right? Because they're available. There are probably, I think, about a dozen or so of these expansion factions, along with the 2 different starter sets available at the time of me filming this. And so you get to see, okay, how do I want to align things? What color represents what their strengths are, and how do I want to mix and match them on my battlefield? The other thing I liked about this game, in comparison to another game I played recently that is a skirmish element of things with some PvP as well as PvE, player versus player and player versus environment, is that in the other game, I did not feel as though the powers were quite as varied as I would have liked. There was, like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of smash, smash, grab, grab. When you get into each of these characters, there is a lot of manipulation. There is a lot of interaction depending on spatial arrangement. There's just a lot of, if you use a skill, gain this. If you have something within range this, do this. Gain a boon. There's just a lot more of the other non-typical attacks. You don't need everything to be an attack spell, right? It's like the fun part of being D&D is sometimes being the caster that casts a spell in a crazy, unusual way to manipulate the field in a way that someone else hadn't thought of, and then getting the result that makes you feel kind of like, holy crap, I'm a genius. And It has more of that in this with some of this asymmetry, especially between the teams. But there is more within the teams as well. I mean, they're designated a team for a reason, right? And so how you able to use this team is going to be a reflection of your own individual skill more than anything else. And that's probably, again, one of the biggest pros here is that if you like skill-based strategic games, this has it in spades. This is probably one of the most strategic, if not the most strategic, grid-based skirmish game that I have played. I've played a fair amount. And so it does a really, really, really good job of doing that, of moving these champions around on the objective hexes, choosing when you're going to play your banner, choosing when you're going to interact with your minions, choosing when you're going to interact with the other opposing team. And the phasing is also just something I wasn't expecting to like. Having two different phases where you're flipping over from one to the other and then activating all of them at once to set yourself up in position, and then activating individually to adapt tactically to what's going on in front of you in a sort of ping pong back and forth, who can outmaneuver the other one the best, in combination with the end game scoring of this point ladder where you're moving it up and down depending on, you know, how many points you score at the end. And if you win, well, great. And if you don't, reset and do better next time. Cons, again, the rule book needs some work. The rule book could use just a revision of, this is just directly how we go. This is what makes sense. This is the order of operations. Some clarity, some clarifications on things like status effects and bonus actions, and just, okay, when, how, in what cases. But getting past that, the other issue is the learning curve. Because it is easy to get to the table, that does not mean that it is easy strategy-wise. This is a game where if you have players that are not of equal experience, one player will be vastly, vastly ahead of the other. And so that's the other side of things that this game doesn't really give you as good of accounting for in terms of skill level. And that goes along with just the overall strategic nature of this game. If you're looking for something less strategic, if you're looking for something more smash and grab, there are plenty of those out there. You've got a little bit of your lighter, even though the rules isn't that good, in Mythic Battles Pantheon. You've got the upcoming D&D Onslaught, which has just been released from WizKids. You've got other thematic incorporations. You've got your Super Fantasy Brawls. You've got your upcoming Senjutsus. But comparatively, I mean, if you're looking for something that is, again, top tier, well, it starts with a GOD. It's good. It's really freaking good. But it's not going to be for everybody because of those reasons, and because, like I said, of this elephant in the room. I wish that the starter set had at least 4 teams in it, because you don't get the full depth of the tactical, strategic elegance of this game with only having a 1 versus 1. And so I just don't like games that make you buy an expansion almost to get the full feeling of the game in the first place. And that's probably the biggest downside that I can put out there for this as well, because I can see price point then being an issue of saying, I'm willing to spend this, but I don't want to spend this to know whether or not I like it. If I like it, then this is obviously well worth it, but is it worth it if I'm buying this compared to just this? And that's the trouble. The only other thing I can think of as a con that I maybe wouldn't have minded seeing as well is having some of these different objective tiles actually being meaningful, right? Like they're different colors. You can see I've got the yellows, the multicolors, the greens, the blues, all there differently. And I just wish maybe there was some slight difference more so in them on the board that was meaningful to give a little bit more. So it's not having as much of the terrain effects as some of the other games have. But again, that's a minor thing. And to be frank, not having to think about like terrain and elevations and as much line of sight stuff as several of those other games that I've mentioned is also refreshing. And it takes it out of the positioning, that element of things, and makes it more just, I'm going to outmaneuver you. I'm going to out-Napoleon you on the battlefield. And it's nice because the cards give you options. They give you plenty, but they don't overdo it either, because that's the other thing we'll see in this game where there is too much of a good thing when it comes to trying to choose between what you're trying to do and not having it all be as balanced as it can be. And I liked it from that aspect too. So there you go. Godtear from SFG. Thanks for sending it. I'm playing it. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts down below? Let me know. Subscribe. Shoot me a comment. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day. See you around.